Hello, welcome again. Do come in. I remember last time we were enjoying that lovely portrait of the young C.S. Lewis by Ross Wilson, and then thinking about how Lewis met Yeats. So I thought we could read a little bit of Yeats together now. I mean, you can never have too much Yeats. So I was sort of hunting about and seeing some of my Yeats, my nicer old Yeats, are in the study, my study in college. But I've got you. I've got this is just an interesting thing in itself. Some people ask me about how I ended up collecting all these books. Well, I mostly bought them on impulse, second hand, and sometimes even in charity shops. I was in Oxford once, and I really needed a Yeats, a sort of emergency Yeats. I didn't have any Yeats with me, and um, I dipped into the Oxfam shop there, and here's a lovely hardback, very usable, clean, lovely, well-bound Oxford Press collected poems of Yeats, and I got it for £6, and the £6 goes to Oxfam, and it's a lovely thing to have. It's nice to have Yeats in individual volumes as well, and of course, Yeats being Yeats, there are lots of little editions, and there's one here, again talking about bargains. Less than a price of a pint. This is a particularly nice little one because early Yeats love poetry, a poet to his beloved, the early love poems of W.B. Yeats. And they've been, it's lovely. Look at these engravings. Samuel Palmer. There's lots of Samuel Palmer in here. And I love Palmer. Palmer was a disciple. There's the Lonely Tower. Palmer was a disciple of Blake's, as in a curious way Yeats was as well. Let's go over and sit down now. And the poetry of Yeats that certainly first moved Lewis, and which he wrote about in great excitement to his friend Arthur Greeves, was, of course, the poetry of the Celtic twilight period, the wonderful, if you like, a kind of high romantic, but high romantic tinged with a kind of mysticism. I love that Yeats too. I like the later Yeats as well, the Sailing to Byzantium and things like that. But I thought we could enjoy, it's in both of these volumes, but let's look at it in this one. A delightful early lyric from, I think, The Wind in the Reeds, very end of the 19th century, the song of the wandering Aengus. It's a simple, beautiful, kind of numinous lyric. It really wants to be chanted rather than read. I might have a go at doing that, as most of it, I think, is in my mind. It's sort of apropos of that, actually. This particular poem came into my mind when I was reading the letter from Ross Wilson about Lewis. So let me read you the poem first, and then we might just dip back into the Ross Wilson letter. So here's Yeats's The Song of the Wandering Aengus. I went out to the hazel wood because a fire was in my head. And I cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry on a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. When I had laid it on the floor, I went to blow the fire aflame, but something rustled on the floor and someone called me by my name. It had become a glimmering girl with apple blossom in her hair, who called me by my name and ran and faded through the brightening air. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone, and kiss her lips, and take her hands, and walk along long dappled grass, and pluck till time and times are done the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. Well, you can just imagine the young Lewis being enchanted by that poem, and it speaking deep to that experience he had. He writes about in Surprised by Joy, that sort of Sehnsucht, the kind of yearning and longing for something that's just, as it were, on the verge of your experience. And that Yeats evocation of what the Irish call the ashling, the beautiful woman who appears in the dawn and seems almost to be the dawn itself and all its promise, and then vanishes. And I love the way the poem moves from the young man to the old man. Of course, I read this poem myself as an ardent young man in my late teens, and resounded to it in that way. And yet now I reread it, and I suppose I can reasonably say at this stage that I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands. And still, you have this sense of being drawn through what is to what is beyond. And that lovely evocation, as it were, of the gardens of the Hesperides and the silver apples of the moon, the golden apples of the sun. The other thing really moved me about this poem when I first read it, I was full of not only Yeats, but my mind was always full of Shelley, as was Yeats's mind. And I always think that, when he says, when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, that kind of conjunction of the moth and the star, I'm sure he was echoing Shelley's lovely little love lyric, the one that goes, I cannot give what men call love, but wilt thou not accept not the worship the heart lifts above and the heavens reject not, the desire of the moth for the star, of the night for the morrow, the devotion to something afar from the sphere of our sorrow. Yeats captures just that same Shelleyan sort of lyric lift and yearning. Anyway, the reason why this poem in particular came to my mind, apropos of our chat about Lewis and Yeats, was actually, I tucked it into my Yeats here actually, my letter from the artist Ross Wilson, which I read to you last time, where he writes about Lewis as known by and yet not knowing the great angler who had his hook well fastened into that young life, whom God would land and use to bring countless others to the further shore. And it came to my mind because, of course, one of the magical things, the kind of unspoken things in that beautiful Yeats lyric, is that it starts off with the idea that the narrator, the poet, is doing the fishing, as it were, that he casts his line, he hooks a berry on a stream, and he catches his little silver trout. But, of course, as the poem unfolds, we realise it's not the trout that was caught, which then transforms into the glimmering girl, but the poet, and that he's the one who's, as it were, drawn ever afterwards out of what he thought of his natural realm, this world, towards this other one, this long and beautiful draw. So the kind of the evocation of how what you thought you were doing suddenly becomes a drawing of you towards another. And of course, I mean, Yeats wouldn't, of course, I think, want to acknowledge this, but those of us who are Christian readers of Yeats can't help but think of that mysterious and, I think, tremendously liberating saying of Jesus in John's Gospel, where he says, looks at the disciples full of their self-doubts, and he says, you have not chosen me, but I have chosen you. And somehow the beautiful reversal in the Yeats poem at least feeds into my imagination, or nourishes in my imagination, a deeper and more effective way of understanding that saying of Jesus, that even as I thought I was choosing, I was being chosen. Anyway, thanks for dropping in.